we're going to be looking at today and then get right into it. So we're looking at funding issues facing Australian councils, and I would love to hear any other issues from anyone who knows what's going on in councils. I might have missed some. We're going to look at a new stormwater utility charge, the types of models, and then we'll have Victoria's case study on Mississauga. So here we go. So very quickly, Stormwater Shepherds, we are committed to restoring riparian environments, and we're doing this through providing solutions to decision makers on how to manage and fund stormwater correctly, and sharing our knowledge with community and councils on the importance of stormwater and the role that everyone plays in stormwater. Okay, so I've been talking to many people in councils, and the thing that I'm finding is that the key pressure for councils is maintaining and managing stormwater correctly. There just are not the funds there, and it's really heartening to see that in some of the stormwater management strategies that the councils are actually facing this. And as you can see, this is direct from one of the strategies, and it's actually saying WUSID assets are often left off asset management databases and maintenance schedules from inadequate operational funding. So you've got a loss of return on investment for the WUSID assets that have already been put in, as well as not correctly managing the stormwater. So let's quickly look at some of these funding issues. So one of the biggest ones is obviously the backlog. I know virtually every single council in Australia has got a backlog from the ageing and crumbling infrastructure. And one of the things that I've really found is that there's a disconnect between the useful life of a stormwater asset. So some strategies have like 50 to 80 years, others go from 80 to 100 years, some even go as far as 150 years. And that is quite frightening, because most of the assets will not last that long. This actually happened just down the road from where I was working back in 2007. It was a huge piece of highway that it was just washed away. Council had been building a huge industrial estate, so there was a lot more impervious surface and stormwater coming through this aged culvert, and during this massive storm that we were having, it was washed away, and very sadly a car fell into there, and an entire family lost their lives along with a cousin. So there were 3 children and 2 adults, and it was just tragic having to live through that. And as a business, it was extremely hard. A lot of people would not come up to our business because they were so scared of the state of the roads. So there's a lot of things to think about when it's been aged infrastructure is not kept up to date. And as I was saying, we've got the lack of funds to support maintenance for installed stormwater assets. There's also the infrastructure responsibilities to replacing networks and pipes that are built ages ago and are too small to cope with the extended impervious surfaces. So that also assists in quite often flash flooding in suburban areas as well. Obviously, the lack of capital funding for new infrastructure, and there's quite often a competition. I'm hearing from councils that they've got the strategy, they want to try and implement it, but then there's another crisis in another department, so money that was actually focused on new infrastructure goes somewhere else. There's also a kind of a disconnect I've been hearing between internal departments about low-cost maintenance preferred over correct stormwater management. And I've got a story from a councillor who told me that a developer who was building, I think it was 70 or 80 houses in a development, was really quite focused on having the correct stormwater management, because he knew that the stormwater would go directly into a local bay. And the stormwater department was really happy, brilliant outcome, took it eventually to the assets department, and they stopped virtually most of the stormwater infrastructure because they knew that they would not be able to maintain it, and they didn't want to take that on. So one of the things that I'm finding down here in New South Wales is that some councils are actually now starting to ensure that in the DA there is a clause there that the the property owner actually has to take on the maintenance of that stormwater. And then it's up to the council to obviously inspect that and make sure that that's happening. And also financing increased council ownership of assets from new developments. That kind of is clicking in with my last one. There's also external pressures, like there's huge development pressures keeping costs down because there's so many rising costs at the moment, and the lack of funds to support inspections. So most councils don't have the resources to go out and actually inspect, make sure that the infrastructure has been installed correctly, or that it's even been hooked up after the development has been ticked off. Okay, there's also increased lawsuits, obviously from flooding and loss of life. However, there is one that the United Nations has identified, and there's an increase globally on the fundamental human rights for clean water and safe food. And this is where governments and private industry are actually being taken to the courts, and they've got climate science assisting them, and they're hoping that this can possibly help save the world. Okay, so who benefits from correctly managed stormwater? It's the ratepayers. Councils will have beautifully happy ratepayers because they're going to have clean water for leisure activities. There's going to be increased leisure areas, and they're going to see reduced flooding. Business and industry are going to benefit because they're going to be meeting legal requirements, and depending on the funding, there could be incentives to proactively manage their stormwater, and there's also going to be the reduced flood risk for implications for their service interruption. Obviously, there's going to be a healthy waterways and riparian environments and safe food with the LGA's biodiversity. Councils are really going to benefit because you're going to have very happy ratepayers. You're going to see an increased economy. You're going to see reduced complaints, reduced pressure from flooding events, and reduced chance of lawsuits. So I think councils are the big winner here. The economy obviously is going to see increased revenue from water-related industries such as fishing, bird watching, leisure, less insurance payouts from flooding, and obviously the big win is also for ocean biota, with the healthy aquatic animals and plants environments, healthy food chains, less animal trauma, less extinction, and healthy oceans to support all life forms. And why am I even mentioning the oceans? The oceans are critical to our human survival. So 50% of the world's oxygen comes from the ocean, 75% of the world's life forms live in, on, or around the ocean. Our oceans actually absorb 50 times more carbon dioxide than our atmosphere, and we've got so many medicinal products from the ocean. And obviously the world is covered in 70% of water. Okay, so what is a stormwater charge? It's a user pay. So the more you pay, the more you pay. It's a fair, safe, and accountable user pay charge for private, commercial, and industrial properties' impact on stormwater. So it's commensurate to the property's stormwater. So this house is just remember this house because I'm going to talk about it a little bit further, and is 2 streets away. It's absolutely giant, sits on about 800 square meters, and the impervious surface is ginormous. So what has happened? What countries are actually implementing this? Germany, most cities over 100,000 have implemented a user pay system. This started back in 2001, and they've got 2 models: an assumed impervious surface. So they actually have done as kind of a statistical sampling and then divvy it up, and there's an average and everyone pays that, and that is not popular, and it is not as fair, because Germany started their user pay system through fairness, not through mitigating flooding or for the environment. It was through fairness. So their other area of property is, which is the preferred model, is the actual impervious area of a property, and I'll get into that a little bit later on. USA has been working in this since the 1970s, and they've got 1,800 municipalities in 41 states who have adopted this user pay system, and they have actually 7,500 municipalities or councils across the USA. And just recently I was reading that the EPA last year actually stated that urban stormwater is the only major source of water pollution that is growing all over the country, and I believe it is actually growing here in Australia too, some possibly because of COVID. And across the US, stormwater remains the least funded out of the three waters, and that's exactly the same as over here. So we're kind of duplicating the states. And last year there was a National Governors Association workshop in April 21, and they really looked at what was going on with stormwater. And like most of the municipalities, they use utility rates and general funds, and it's exactly the same as over here in Australia. And they can see that that is unfair and unable to manage stormwater correctly. So they're all going to be recommending models for governors to implement, and the governors can actually make this happen, that they're going to go to their jurisdictions and say, this needs to happen. They also have a Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which is 1.7 billion shared between states and territories. And this is kind of very low interest loans where states can take on projects of infrastructure, not maintenance. And then once they've paid that loan back, it then rolls over to someone else who's going to do more capital works. Canada's got at least 6 user pay models. They've got credit programs, and I'm not going to get into any of this because I'm going to leave all that up for Victoria. But they've got recognition programs with rain gardens, etc. One of the best things about the user pay system is it actually creates substantial jobs. What you look at is it's a whole new stormwater department in a council, from accounts right down to inspectors and marketing and rangers, and it's a great community kind of vibe as well, because the council's really engaging and enacting with the ratepayers and constituents. And obviously there's going to be substantial job growth and maintenance from the backlog and just maintaining and capital works. Okay, so quickly looking at the stormwater charges, it's quite wide actually, and in the States you've got 1,800 municipalities who've adopted it, and not one is the same, whereas in Canada they're more aligned to each other. So you go from the flat fee, like here in New South Wales, where you've got $25 per year, to the individualised assessments, which is the fairest and most revenue. So let's look at what is happening in Canada, because I'm going to use Canada. It's much simpler than the States. So Canada, for example, with a flat rate, here's the city of Markham. They charge $47 per residential property, including individual condominium. I can't even say the words, units per annum. And obviously for non-residential, it's higher, it's $26 per 100,000 of the current value assessment. So the pros are that it's very easy to administer, it's a low-cost option, it can actually be tiered to also be small, medium or large, but it's not measured against the impervious area. So you have obviously less revenue, it's not fair at all, it is the most contested, and there is no real engagement between council and the ratepayers. There's a runoff coefficient model, which is the town of Newmarket, and that is, so you've got the low runoff, which is the parks and golf courses and playing fields, then you've got the residential, so they're all the same, which, and then you've got the high runoff, which is commercial. So that really is not very fair either, so that's coming up a little bit more from being the absolute flat rate. Then you've got the equivalent residential unit, which is ERU. This is one of the preferred options in Canada, and this is in the city of Guelph, and this is gauged on the statistical, they do a statistical sampling of all the impervious areas in residential housing, and then they average that out, and that average is charged to everyone. So it's still not really that fair, it's still contested, and it's a kind of a medium administration. We've got the tiered single family unit in the city of Mississauga, and I'm going to leave that for Victoria. Then you've got the individual impervious area assessments, and this is by far the most revenue raising, the fairest, the least contested, but it does add a lot more admin, and this is where you really have to set up a full admin department, and everyone gets a separate bill on their rates notice, very similar to how much water you pay, how much water you use. So that is actually my preferred one, just because of the revenue that it will raise, and it is by far the fairest. There's also the level service model in, which is an example, City of Ottawa. So this is a combination of rural and city, and so obviously rural are going to end up with a much bigger discount than you are in the city. But that all these models do raise more than what we are seeing here in Australia in most areas. So it's really taking a change in mindset. Stormwater is an attractive resource. A user pay fee system is fair, safe and accountable. It's exactly like potable and will cover critical ongoing maintenance costs. And that is where we have to really look at, because for years I can see that stormwater has been talked about, and everyone is saying now it is the funding that is holding us back. We just can't move really forward because we don't have that funding. We run stormwater like a business. It's set up as a sustainable department or agency. Councils should be looking at including private ownership stormwater assets to be maintained by the owner of the property, rather than take on that ownership, so that they can be maintained. And I think we've all got to start thinking about our planet's future, because we're hearing a lot of tragic things happening in our waterways. And so I am actually on time, and I'm going to hand this over to Victoria. I'll leave it up to you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be invited, and I'm really excited to share the case study of City of Mississauga and what we did there with improving our stormwater system funding and how we did that. Next slide, please, Mary. So just to orient everyone, so Mississauga is a city in the province of Ontario. It's a relatively large city, so over 800,000 people by now. We have about 22 kilometers of shoreline on Lake Ontario, which is one of Canada's Great Lakes, and part of the largest freshwater system in the world. A lot of parks, we have woodlands, green spaces throughout the city, and in general, it's quite a developed city, pretty built out. It was built over a relatively rapid period of time, about 30 to 50 years ago. So pretty built out, not a lot of new development, but quite a bit of retrofitting and infill development. Next slide, please. So for Mississauga, really our journey to implementing a stormwater charge began in 2012 when we commissioned a stormwater feasibility study, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, to determine what the best way was for us to fund our stormwater system. We knew we had shortfalls in funding, we knew we had needs, but we needed to determine what the best way was forward. There are several different options to fund stormwater systems beyond just user fees, and so we wanted to look at that and be presented with options. Now, we knew what the pressures were that were facing our stormwater system. So the big reason that we really looked to move towards a user fee model was because of flood management. We were certainly prone to both riverine flooding as well as urban flooding, and that was a really big issue for us. We also knew that we were going to have to implement some really big infrastructure projects to deal with that flooding, and we also knew that because Mississauga was built out at a relatively short period of time, that all of our infrastructure was aging at the same time. It was going to need renewal within a relatively short period of time. We had those ongoing operations and maintenance excuse me, pressures, and that also included monitoring and enforcing our spills bylaw. And we also knew that we were experiencing more extreme storm events and flooding, and that we would continue to experience these, and this is something that we would have to prepare for. Next slide, please. So what was the rationale for us to implement a stormwater user fee? So first off, it was a more fair distribution of cost among different types of properties. And fairness was really one of the guiding principles that we adopted in implementing the user fee. So previously, our stormwater system was funded through property taxes, which is based on the value of the property, but isn't really very indicative of the amount of pressure that a property places on the stormwater system. We changed to a system, which I'll explain in a little bit, that was based more on impervious surface. So you can see here on the left, prior to that, when we were still funded through property taxes, the majority of funding came through residential properties, which are the majority by number of properties in Mississauga. However, those industrial and commercial and institutional properties, while they're the minority of properties by number, they're actually the majority of hard surface in Mississauga. So once we changed to a user fee model, there was a more fair redistribution of who pays. Next slide, please. One of our big desires was to also increase the amount of funding that we had. And so prior to the stormwater charge being implemented, we would be allocated anywhere from about $6 to $16 million Canadian a year to support our stormwater system, both in capital and operating costs. The first year that we implemented the charge, this went up to $32 million. So really significant difference, and ultimately pretty transformative in what we were able to achieve. That said, some municipalities that I know have maintained more of a revenue neutral approach, which can be an option too. Another big reason for us to implement this was to have a dedicated budget. So we have a stormwater rate that is reviewed annually as part of the city's budget process. It's subject to public debate, and council, our elected officials, our councillors and mayor, all debated as well too, just like they do the general budget. But we know that we have a dedicated amount that we can count on from year to year, which allows us to plan more sustainably. Next slide, please. So the process that we went through, I mentioned the stormwater feasibility study, and that's really a big first step that most Canadian municipalities undertake before they switch to a user fee structure. It can be relatively basic or much more detailed, but typically it will estimate what your shortfall is, provide a recommended approach, in this case user fees, to pay for that, and may even delve into some of the analysis that will inform your rate. I mentioned some of our guiding principles, and so this was something that we really always try to adhere to. Transparency, and I'll show you some examples of what that looks like, fairness, and also consistency, so applying the same process to all types of properties. We also struck an advisory committee composed of different stakeholders and major property owners to help guide us as we brought different parts of the user fee program to them, and were able to sort of adjust that in an iterative way. We had public information centers to get feedback from the public, and we also assessed the resources we had in place when it came to staff, when it came to managing property-related data, when it came to billing, in order to determine what we had in place and what we would need, both to develop the charge, but also to operate it on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. A really important piece in developing our user fee was building internal consensus. So, you know, we needed buy-in from our councillors and our mayor, as well as other municipal staff as well too. This was a very cross-divisional project that involved a lot of different teams, not just the stormwater team. So there's some different ways we did this, and a lot of this is how you frame the issue and frame the need. for a user fee. So obviously I had mentioned some of the pressures that Mississauga was facing, and this provided a really good opportunity to address things in the long term. It also provided us, while we weren't the first municipality in Canada to adopt a user fee system, we definitely did have a very publicized one, and it was relatively sophisticated in how it was approached. And so it really allowed us to position this as us taking a position of municipal leadership when it came to other cities in Canada. At the same time, it is a proven funding solution that we've seen in Canada and also in the United States. So you're still walking a path that has been walked by many other towns and cities. And it was very helpful to find a council champion. So in this case, it was our mayor at the time who heard about this happening in another municipality and wanted to know why we weren't doing it. And so it was really great to have someone on council who could speak to the councillors and elected officials and to help pave the way. Next slide, please. So the model that we chose is the single family unit model. And so what this, the way this is approached is we did a statistical sampling of 2,000 residential or single family properties in Mississauga, various different kinds. So detached homes, semi-detached homes, freehold townhouses, to determine the average amount of hard surface on the average residential property in Mississauga. And this amount of hard surface is called one single family unit, or SFU, of hard surface. And so for the way essentially that we would determine it, and I'll determine the charge for property, and I'll show you what that looks like for both residential and non-residential properties in a moment, is we would assess each property, how many SFUs or billing units, if you will, of hard surface are on that property. We would multiply it by the stormwater rate for that particular year, and then you would get your stormwater charge for that property. And then I'll show you what that looks like for different types of properties. So for residential properties, we based the amount of hard surface expected to be seen on a property on roof area. And that's for two different reasons. We found while we were doing this analysis that there was a very good correlation, at least in Mississauga, between total roof area on a property and total hard surface. So, you know, including also the driveways, the pathways, all of that. And also roof area was something that the city already mapped. And so this helped us to be a bit more efficient, reduce some of the administration. So based on roof area, we determined the amount of billing units or SFUs of hard surface on a residential property. And residential properties were slotted into one of 5 tiers, ranging from the very smallest all the way to the very largest with the most roof area. And these charges that you see were from, I believe, last year, and this is an annual charge. So the very largest or highest roof area properties, which was really only, I think, the top 5% of residential properties, were charged a total of just over $180 per year for their stormwater charge. Next slide, please. Now, for those non-residential properties, for industrial and commercial and institutional properties, that roof area to hard surface ratio didn't really hold up. And so for each of these properties, we would map the total impervious area on each of them, and then we would divide that by the amount of square meters found in 1 billing unit or SFU of hard surface. Now, so this was a much more individualized approach, but if you'll recall, you know, these properties, while they're the minority of properties in Mississauga, have the majority of hard surface. So this is really worth that administration and that extra work to get it right. And we had one assessment for each property, even if it was a condominium with maybe multiple units or an industrial property with multiple units, only one assessment per property. Next slide, please. So what did the billing look like? You know, as Mary mentioned, it looked very similar to what you would see on your water wastewater bill. And in fact, we worked with the region of Peel, which is sort of a different level of government who manages water, wastewater, to have it appear on their bill. So you would see, if you were a resident in Mississauga, you would see one line for your water charges for the month. You would see, or for the quarter, if you're residential, you would see one line for your wastewater charges, and then you would see one line for your stormwater charges. So the majority of properties receive their bill on a quarterly basis, with those really high water users receiving them on a monthly basis. And then, as I mentioned, when you have sometimes maybe a property where there might be multiple units that have separate water bills, you would still only have one stormwater bill for that property, and then it would be up to the property owner or the property manager to divide that up appropriately. Next slide, please. So a few different considerations that, you know, we needed to keep in mind, and some of these are lessons learned as well too. So some of these didn't become apparent until we really started implementing our stormwater charge. So like I said, you really want to think about the resources, the staff resources, the data management resources that you have available, both for implementation, but also for that ongoing operation. Some towns and cities that have implemented stormwater user fees have an upper limit for charges where they won't go above a certain amount. We chose not to. So there are indeed some very, very large, hard surface heavy properties in Mississauga that have stormwater charges going into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. There will always be some kind of a cutoff, and someone will always be on the wrong side of it or perceived wrong side of it. So for example, I mentioned the residential tiered system, and you know, without fail, you will have some residential properties that are 0.1 square meters over into the next larger tier. And you know, we did have an appeal process, so that's something to consider as well too. But if upon reviewing the property, you are still 0.1 square meters into that next tier, you know, that's where the consistency piece came in, and we were always consistent, never bumping up or down. And that's something else to remember as well too, is that it's really helpful to limit staff and elected official discretion in how individual properties are assessed to keep that fairness and transparency. And something else to think about as well too, which we did implement, was compassionate relief subsidies for certain types of properties. For example, low-income seniors, perhaps nonprofit organizations. We didn't implement that one, but we did implement for places of worship as well too, and agricultural properties, a subsidy in recognition of some of the financial pressures that they face. Next slide, please. We also implemented various outreach tools for the launch of the stormwater charge. So I'd mentioned our advisory committees. We had a variety of web resources. We did in-person engagement. This was obviously all pre-COVID. We did mail outs to every property in Mississauga. But we also had, and this was really useful, an online stormwater charge estimator, where you could type in your address and you could see what your annual stormwater charge would be. You would see the mapped aerial imagery that we used. And so that helped, I think, people to sort of avoid some surprises. But you could also type in, let's say, your next door neighbor's address. You could type in the address of the mall down the street. And so in this particular case, certainly, you know, sometimes we got phone calls from people who were asking why they were paying more than their next door neighbor. But at the same time, this was really part of our transparency approach, where we really wanted to be open about what our stormwater charge was and how it is calculated. Next slide, please. And for us, you know, stormwater, our stormwater system and stormwater management in some ways is sort of a silent but essential service. And people don't really notice your stormwater system until it doesn't work and they're flooded, or there's a spill, or some really negative event. Now, with launching our stormwater charge, we suddenly did have a lot of public attention on stormwater management. And so we wanted to use this to help to educate the public on stormwater management overall and how it helps to protect their property, even what our stormwater system is. For us, we found there was actually a lot of confusion between what our wastewater system is versus stormwater. So we engaged in a lot of different approaches to educate the public on stormwater management. And frankly, this is a whole other presentation that I could do, so I won't get too deeply into it. But we did try to tailor different approaches to different audiences. Mississauga is a very multicultural city, and so we tried to utilize some of the language skills of our staff to reach out to different communities. We also tried, something we were really excited about is we tried to engage people in the stormwater system based on, things that they enjoy, like public art. So we had a public art event where artists did an art performance and turned stormwater infrastructure into art over the course of a day. Next slide, please. Now, something that people often ask about are incentives and credit programs for incentivizing best management practices on private properties. And stormwater charges can be a vehicle for this. Looking particularly at industrial and commercial and institutional properties, again, those really big hard surface properties, stormwater credits are usually the most common type of incentive. It can be, an incentive for property owners to lower their stormwater charge. It's also, I would say, quite important to consider both from whether people adopt it or not, or utilize it or not, that you have given them an option to lower their stormwater charge, and it can also help you avoid legal challenges down the road too. Next slide, please. So Mississauga's stormwater credit program is based on 4 different categories. Different best management practices fall into different categories, and you get up to a maximum of a certain percentage in each category. Some best management practices might fall into more than one category, so you are allowed to double dip, if you will. But the total credit that you can receive is 50% off your stormwater charge. And again, this is for those institutional, commercial, industrial properties. Next slide, please. So we learned a lot of lessons from the implementation of our credit program. So they are very important to offer, again, so that there is at least an option for those properties with the really high stormwater charges to decrease their charge. At the same time, we found, and I know many other Canadian cities have also found this, that sometimes credit programs have relatively low uptake. We found that uptake tended to be more from existing best management practices on properties that had already implemented them. And this is not necessarily surprising because, property owners won't necessarily rip up a perfectly good asphalt parking lot and turn it into permeable pavement right off the bat. But the hope is, as they are retrofitting over time, that this will be an option that they're going to consider when the opportunity arises. That said, we do find that those property owners do need a lot of support when it comes to guidance, when it comes to understanding options, in order to surmount some of the barriers to implementing best management practices and getting into that credit process. Next slide, please. So in recognition of this, Mississauga is currently looking at a lot of different options now for their credit program. And so this is still very much in the development phase, but it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. One thing that they're looking at is the option to share credits among multiple properties using communal best management practices, recognizing that one property might have more space for a certain best management practice and other properties might be able to drain into it. So that's something that they're looking at. They're looking at a sliding scale of credits based on geographical locations. And it could be, they might determine it based on, the age of the development or the location in the watershed or other factors. They're looking at maybe having more flexibility in those different credit categories, and also looking at market-based incentives too. So getting those vendors and those contractors and consultants that would typically implement different best management practices, or that would typically maybe implement retrofits that don't have much to do with stormwater management, and educate them and maybe give them incentives to market those stormwater best management practices to their clients. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to residential properties, you'll find less credit programs in Canada. Certainly the advantages of having a residential credit program is to increase recognition of the best practices that are out there, to engage homeowners and to reward them for when they have done good work, and also to mitigate complaints from the residential sector for not having that same option to reduce their stormwater charge. On the downside, residential credit programs tend to have relatively high administration costs, both initial costs and then on an ongoing basis. If somebody is paying $100 a year for the stormwater charge, is it worthwhile to go out every year to see if they've put their rain barrel back out in the spring? The credit amounts tend to be relatively low, especially in comparison with that charge amount. Again, if you're charged $100 a year, are you going to spend $50 on a rain barrel? Usually people will implement those best practices on a residential property for other reasons. And they often need quite a bit of guidance as well. What I will say is that while residential credit programs, some have been implemented in Canada, but if not implemented, it is still important to offer a proactive approach to recognizing residential properties that have implemented best practices and have done good work. So next slide, please, and I'll show you what we did to encourage some of ours. We implemented a stormwater home visit pilot program where we hired stormwater advisors to go to residential properties at the property owner's request, give them sort of an assessment of what they could do on their property, both to manage stormwater and just regarding environmental sustainability in general. And then if desired, they could also get a free rain barrel. And we got great uptake. For that, we had spaces for 120 properties, and registration filled up within 36 hours of us opening it up. And we did a survey afterwards and found that about 20% of properties had implemented at least one of the recommended measures within 2 weeks of their assessment. Next slide, please. So just to finish up, what do some of these outcomes from implementing a user fee for Mississauga look like? So as I mentioned, our initial motivation was really quantity control and flooding. And so since the implementation of the stormwater charge, we've been able to implement some really significant stormwater quantity control infrastructure that includes various underground storage galleries. We've done a lot of sediment removal from stormwater management ponds, extending their lives, and we've undertaken environmental assessments for major capital projects related to riparian flooding. We've also increased our focus on low impact development. So bioswales, rain gardens, permeable pavement, and those kinds of options as well too. And have also implemented a pipe renewal reserve, knowing again that our storm sewers are all aging at about the same time. We began with very modest deposits into the pipe renewal reserve, and it's currently valued at about 30 million this year. Next slide, please. But one of the great things too about implementing the user fee is that it allowed us to increasingly focus on water quality and also on asset management as well too. So Mississauga is nearing completion of a stormwater asset management planning process. This is required now through provincial legislation, but at the same time, its funding has allowed us to really do a good job of that. Mississauga also hired storm sewer bylaw enforcement officer was able to escalate education and enforcement when it came to water quality at industrial properties. And the city is also developing a stormwater master plan as well too.